which Putin thought would end quite quickly. It's been about 16 months since you had the attacks in Gaza on October 7th of 23, and you've had a little over a month since President Trump has returned to the and nothing's been the same since any of those days in the world. And yesterday we had a good sense of that with the UN resolution, which basically said Russia didn't start the war in Ukraine. So I'm going to basically ask Hamlet to join to put some clarity into where the conflicts are going, and are we getting closer to an end or the start of something new? Last week on our call, somebody raised this question, and we had the view that this is the start of something new, Hamlet and I, that we're not as close to the end as everyone would hope, certainly as close to the end as President Trump was kind of indicating. What's going on right now has created a highly elevated economic uncertainty, but also policy uncertainty around the world. This report takes a look at newspaper mentions of uncertainty. It looks at shifts in government policy, and it looks at surveys of professional forecasters. And you can see the economic uncertainty today is higher than it was when the pandemic was going on, and significantly higher than it was when Russia invaded Ukraine back in 2022. And what you can see here, this is a survey from an armed conflict survey, which actually looks at the human impact, and they define it by the number of fatalities due to violent events in a specific country, the number of refugees originating in a select country, and the number of internally displaced people. So you can see the hardship that the conflicts around the world are extracting, but it's not just Ukraine and Gaza, it's many other places around the world, and that is actually stressing governments' abilities to deal with, particularly the U.S. Is in a spot where they're battling free fronts. How do we get here? I think this really comes down to a very simple fact that China's risen to a level that they are challenging the U.S. for global leadership, and there's a conflict in how they resolve that shift. And I think we're also seeing the fact that the United Nations, NATO, and other post-World War II institutions probably have outgrown what their original intent was, and they need to be modernized to deal with a world that's very different than it was, not only post-World War II, but even 20 years ago with China's rise and the rise of other nations as well. I think we've had a problem with bad leadership. I've talked about that in the past. It, to me, is one of the most scary issues we're facing is weak leadership making bad decisions that are short-term oriented, just about the next election cycle, and not dealing with the pain, the necessary pain that comes with making hard decisions, which has led to significant underinvestment in critical areas. And then the last thing that led to what has us where we are today is really the Trump factor. And if you want to follow and understand what's ahead of us and what's going on right now, all you have to do is look at the 2024 Republican platform, and this is the playbook that Trump follows. And whether you like him or hate him, one thing you should know about the Trump administration is he's going to try and do what he laid out in his platform, whether it's good policy or bad policy. In his mind, it's good policy, and he's going to push forward with it. So even things that don't make sense, he's going to move forward with. He's also going to create a lot of conflicting statements that are going to be challenging both for foreign leaders, for domestic CEOs and for CEOs and business leaders around the world, and also for people, investors trying to make strong investment decisions. But understand these 20 points because this is the playbook that he's following right now. Global defense spending is on the rise, and we know that it's been carried over very heavily by the U.S., China, and Russia, and in purchasing power parity, you would see Russia and China spending over $460 billion each last year. Europe combined spent a little less than a third of what the U.S. has spent, and part of what the goal is to get them to increase that significantly and ease some of the burden on the U.S. While a lot of people think it may be for them to redirect money to other areas, I think one of the challenges that the U.S. has is a massive modernization and rebuild, and to be able to be prepared for fighting on three fronts, where Russia is fighting on one right now. In the Gaza, it's really Ukraine, and in Gaza, it's really Israel and the U.S. Taking on Iran and their proxies. And then you have what's going on in the South China Sea. The U.S. cannot afford to fight China and two other battles at once. And that's really what's weighing on the U.S. because number one on the U.S.'s mind, I believe, is dealing with China, not dealing with Russia and the Middle East is more of a short-term issue. The big longer-term issue is the ascension of China and how do we deal with that. But I think the other issue is because we're fighting in three fronts right now, we're preparing to battle on three fronts. I think this quote from Finland's foreign prime minister really is quite true. It's not reasonable right now for the U.S. to be able to do this, whether it's not just financially, but practically. Can we afford to do it? We don't have the military buildup right now, and we've exhausted a lot of our military supplies being at war for most of the last 20 years. So European leaders are facing a very harsh reality right now. It's what you can see from this chart is defense spending as a proportion of GDP, and it shows how imbalanced it's been, and those closest to the action, either with migrants coming through or with being close to the borders of Russia, or where the higher spend is and the lower spend has been not coming through from the rest of Europe. And this is creating a big problem. As you can see, the demands for future spend are going to be much higher. And they're talking about 3.7% or 5%. And this is what the additional spending would look like over the next decade. And this is coming at a time that most of these governments have massive demands from their domestic population that go well beyond the defense spending that's going to help other parts of the world. But I think it was NATO head Ruth who said the other day, if they don't get the 3.7%, they better start learning Russian in Europe. And I think that may be an extreme, but maybe not. This is a problem that chronic underinvestment has been going on for way too long, and the catch-up is going to be the problem. And if we're doing better all along, this would be less of a burden, but it's coming at a particularly bad time, particularly interest rates moving up to the 4% level, and we don't have the benefits of free money that we had for the last 15 years. So we're in a tough spot in Europe. We're trying to figure out can Trump force a settlement in on these people in different parts of the world. I'm skeptical of it. I don't think we're close to the end of a war. I mentioned that last week, but I asked Hamlet Yusuf to join. So Hamlet, if you could just give a little bit of your background first, and then we'll jump into the Q&A.
Yeah, that sounds good. Appreciate it. Looking forward to the conversation here. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. My name is Hamlet Yusuf, one of the managing partners at Iron Gate Capital Advisors. We're a defense tech-focused venture fund. This thesis was built about 6-7 years ago when we thought that the world was going down a new direction where the kind of the global war on terror was winding down. That's an issue that we're going to continue to have to deal with, but the near conflict or the issue that was going to face us geopolitically was a reemergence of a second Cold War, or if not a much graver conflict. I think it was right after the Ukraine invasion, on one of the calls here with the folks at 360, I talked about how the world is going down the path of almost like a 3-act tragedy. Act 1 was going to be the invasion of Ukraine and the destabilizing impact that was going to have in the region and globally. Act 2 of this geopolitical tragedy was the emergence, or was going to be the emergence, of a very belligerent Iran with a nuclear undertone trying to destabilize the Middle East. And Act 3 was the emergence that the kind of driving force behind this was a desire by Xi and the Chinese Communist Party to become the only superpower, not a superpower, but the only superpower, and supplant Western influence, which obviously includes the U.S. Globally. Unfortunately, I think a lot of that has been happening. Just quick color again on background. Prior to running Iron Gate, I had a long career in the federal government, in the national security, diplomacy, and intelligence area. So this is an area that I've been pretty keen on and following for a good chunk of my adult life. So I think Stephen's earlier slide, or the opening slide, says it very clearly. I think this is the beginning of a much greater conflict. I do not think global peace is breaking out anytime in the near future. I think the three main hot wars, or the hot zones you see right now, Ukraine, the Israel-Gaza, Iran conflict, and the South China Sea and Southeast Asia. I think the tenor of those conflicts is going to change in the coming months and year. I think there is potentially, quote unquote, a grand bargain that President Trump is going to try to strike to stabilize matters to a certain extent, but I think that's going to bring more of a kind of a calm before the eye of the storm, rather than everlasting peace. So I'll stop there, and then Stephen, I guess let me know in what direction we want to take the Q&A.
Can I ask a question, Stephen? Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear, Mark.
Oh, did you see this veto coming, and the way the alignment is shifting with Trump and Putin?
Oh, the UN veto as far as negating the UN the
Resolution?
Yeah, no, I definitely did not see that coming. I think the one thing that is going to be probably very predictable for the next 4 years is unpredictability. Love him or hate him, I think Trump's style of governance and leadership is to completely upset the apple cart, create chaos, and operate through it, whether that's through willful intent or just that's how he operates. So I'll leave that for another call. So I don't think anybody saw that coming, to be honest with you.
The questions from others? Oh, you're on mute, Stephen, but Michael Hammer?
Sure. More of a comment than a question. I mean, yesterday I felt like I was in a bizarro world where the US voted with Russia and North Korea against allies of 80 years. This is crazy. So my comment on this is, and I've been speaking with friends in Europe who are involved with government and the military, and some folks here in the States. Everybody is in shock. And the sense that I get from the Europeans is we are going to see a schism between the US and Europe. And they're going to be going towards a wartime economy. Most folks are denying it these days, but this is huge. And I think China's just sitting there. Xi is just sitting there laughing at what's going on because it all falls in their favor. And I'll stop with that. What do you think, Yusuf?
That was actually a question I had for Yusuf.
Yeah.
Yusuf, do you think China wants any of these wars to end as fast as Trump does?
I honestly, I don't know. I don't know. I think China benefits through continued destabilization. I think what China wants to do is it wants to weaken all powers. So a prolongment of a conflict in Ukraine kind of helps does that. It distracts the West and the U.S. In Eastern Europe, and it continues to weaken Russia to a certain extent, which is, I think, what Xi wants. I think Xi's ultimate goal is to expand his influence in Southeast China and potentially in the Nepalese steppe. So the weaker your adversaries become, the stronger you become. One dynamic to consider is a good chunk of the first Cold War, the West really tried to keep the two communist powers apart in terms of China and Russia. What's happened over the last couple of years, obviously, is you have this formation of an axis of authoritarianism between Xi, Putin, and the regime inside Iran. So almost the exact opposite is happening. But to me, I think this is where Xi sees these nations as his quote unquote proxy allies in a longer term effort to destabilize the US and the West and to assert their dominance in the region. But I don't think that's going to end well for a whole host of reasons. I'm still, I think, very skeptical on how long this Xi Putin romance remains. And I want to point to just a couple of anecdotal observations. Kind of at the height of the explosion of the Ukraine war, this is going back to September 2023. Xi made a tour, I believe, throughout the stands, the former Soviet states, and began courting these nations, of which a large chunk of them are Asiatic in their ethnicity and makeup. I think this is an effort for him to pull those folks away from Vlad and closer to his ring of influence. The Chinese have a very long memory, and I think they view things almost like, I mean, you've heard this before, in a centuries long optic, not an election cycle like we do in the West. I don't think they've fully forgotten or forgave what happened to them at the back end of the Opium Wars. And that was an effort that they blame squarely, obviously, on Europe. But in 1850, 1860, when the war ended, Outer Manchuria, better known as Siberia today, was annexed by the Russians away from China and is now part of the Russian government or the Russian the entity. I don't think it's too far of a stretch to say that at some point Xi doesn't want to look at the lands to his north that are grossly underpopulated, grossly underdefended, and rich in natural resources as an area that he can eventually march into. So when you hear the quote that I think Senator McCain first coined, that Russia is nothing other than a big gas station for China, I think there's some truth and merit in there. So if this conflict continues, and I think it's going to, China actually benefits. Now, I do think there's an increasing probability that we're going to have some sort of a grand bargain or an agreement between Putin and the West and potentially China, where you'll see a near-term cease of the firing and the fighting in Ukraine, but that doesn't mean global peace is breaking out and the conflict is over. If anything, I think what you see happening is if that does happen, Ukraine is not ready to give up that land. Russia is not going to retreat and give back Eastern Donbass and Crimea. So I think what you have is potentially a formation of almost like an East Germany, West Germany that we had at the end of the Second World War. From there, we had a decades-long Cold War where both sides were starting to destabilize the other. So if you play this out and Putin does get to hold on to the lands that he stole in Eastern Ukraine, I think he then spends the next decade trying to destabilize Odessa, trying to destabilize Kyiv, trying to put his own proxy or his own person in charge, and then continue with that Western influence that he wants in terms of reforming, reconstituting that Western border. He's doing the same thing in the Caucasus. So that, I think, changes the tenor of the conflict. It may end the near-term direct conflict in Ukraine, but I don't think by any means that's going to be the beginning of the end.
Andrew Fish, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, Hamlet, you're involved obviously in military acquisition technology. The push for getting Europe to spend more, it's still kind of a slow move, but one of the issues is spending it on what? So I'm just going to give you like an analogy and then let you answer the question. So if you take Poland has ramped up their military acquisition, and they're not worried where it comes from. They're buying Korean tanks, they're buying American weapons, they're buying anything they can get their hands on.
Mm-hmm.
I think even Japanese jets, whatever. The point is they're doing it quickly. The other nations upping their expenditure. They didn't spend any money for so long. Their military industrial infrastructure, and you can comment on this, is not ready to ramp up. And they don't want to just buy American. So how much would they have to spend to do a Poland-like catch-up? And is that even possible?
Yeah, great question. Look, I think you're starting to see the awakening of this defense tech initiative throughout Europe. It's something that I think shocked the system in 2016 to 2020 under Trump's first term. I think the explosion of the conflicts on Europe's eastern flank is sending shockwaves throughout the continent. You are starting to see all the countries, for the most part, wake up and start allocating more and more dollars. I think there's a bit of a variance in terms of what that percentage of GDP needs to look like, is going up and exponentially for where it was 4, 5, 6 years ago. But this is also something that the U.S. wasn't necessarily all that worried about. When we first started our fund thesis 6, 7 years ago, defense tech and defense investing was this kind of backwater thesis that nobody cared about. It's all the rage right now here inside the U.S. There's every time you turn around, there's another venture fund or a growth equity fund or a private capital source that has defense innovation, dual use defense tech as part of their thesis. So it is becoming a key area of focus and spend for us here in the U.S. Well, you've seen that same thing start happening in Europe over the last several years, where more and more countries are shifting focus on the need to drive innovation and technology and spend in their defense sector. Now, in terms of dollars, you got to understand the economics of warfare have changed, and this is, I think, something people have not fully grasped and understood. What I mean by that is the wars of having to march columns of tanks and airplanes and ships into a theater to win. That's changing. If not, it's fully ended. And I think the world is starting to realize what does disruptive technologies mean, and how is that reshaping the battlefield. So examples here. If you look at what happened at the beginning of the Ukraine war, you had a column of arms and tanks and armored vehicles that was marching on Kyiv, and this is where everyone thought that Kyiv was going to fall within 48 hours and the war is over. You had a couple billion dollars of armament that was heading down for Kyiv, and you had a handful of Ukrainian special forces bouncing around on ATVs, drones, and some explosive ordinances, a couple $1 million worth of overhead and cost, and that was able to nullify billions of dollars worth of armaments. Look at what happened or what's happening right now in the Red Sea. You have the Houthis, who have no real economic base, and they're launching hundreds of inexpensive drones towards global shipping, and they're shutting down global shipping to a certain extent in that part of the country or in that part of the world. And they're spending a couple $1 million, and the U.S. in return is deploying a couple of $1 billion worth of ships and airplanes and rockets and knock down a couple of pieces of flying lawnmowers is what it seems like. So that's not sustainable. Look what happened in Ukraine about 6 months ago. You had a handful of Ukrainians with a couple $1 million of modified jet skis with explosives put onto them in a remote control device, literally sink and nullify half of the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. So the economics of war are changing, and I think we're starting to grasp and understand what that means. To control a battlefield in a conventional war, two of the things you need to do is you need to control the skies, and ideally, you need to be able to control the seas. In order to do that, you need to field trillions of dollars or deploy trillions of dollars to create and manage a comprehensive air force and a navy. But with where things are going in terms of drone warfare and the collapsing cost of drones, you're starting to get to the point now where nation states that traditionally could not field an air force or a navy are able to basically replicate and recreate that same kind of effect for pennies on the dollar. So I wouldn't necessarily focus as much on the spend in terms of percentage of GDP and how big that war chest needs to be, because you got to understand the technology and the tools and the platforms that are going to be needed to reshape and kind of win this conflict of the 21st century is changing, because the economics of warfare have completely changed.
Phil, you had a question?
There we go. Yeah, I was wondering if Hamlet in particular, if you saw the interview with Marco Rubio and Catherine Herring, I think it was, just the other day. It was on. I saw it reposted on the Rubin Report. That to me was quite interesting. It seemed almost like not even real politic, but like real economic, in terms of those are the terms of the deal that we're trying to push through, and at the same time get peace between Ukraine and Russia. And any thoughts on that one?
Well, I missed that interview. What were the specific terms they discussed? What were some of the top levels that he discussed?
Yeah, it was fascinating because it really centers pretty much all around the rare earths
Hmm.
opportunity
Yep.
and negotiations. Essentially, the way that it boiled down for me is that if Ukraine is willing to give us a piece of that pie, we will come in, with the full weight of everything that we have and sort of demand a peace. But the
Yep.
price of that is absolutely an economic interest in their rare earth production.
Yeah, like I mean, there isn't a single piece of modern technology that functions without some critical minerals or rare earths. And China, for a better part of 20 plus years, has been slowly trying to monopolize that segment in that sector. So it would make sense for us to say, listen, if we're going to come in and kind of help moderate or help bring about peace, one of the things we want in return is access to those critical materials and minerals. So to strike that kind of a bargain to me doesn't to me seem out of the ordinary. But just think about it though. Let's just kind of play this out. If there is a grand bargain, and there is quote unquote peace between Ukraine and Russia, and in return we get access to the U.S. and the West get access to rare earths and critical materials and minerals that basically make our function or make our society function, not to mention play a key part in basically every piece of modern defense tech that's out there. That's a good thing from a stabilization standpoint, but again, it does not mean the conflict is over. I don't think that Xi woke up one day and decided to upset the apple cart. I don't think Putin woke up one day and decided to march westward and kind of light Eastern Europe on fire. I think both of these guys, to a certain extent, have been operating off the same sheet of music, which is expanding their influence in the region and replacing, not counterbalancing, but replacing Western and U.S. influence. So just because there's a cessation of or ceasing in the conflict, direct conflict of shooting each other in eastern Ukraine, I think the tenets of that conflict do not go away. That's why I think we are kind of in the beginnings of a much greater conflict. The difference is going to be it's going to turn from being a war where people are shooting each other to a more cognitive warfare campaign, more of an irregular warfare campaign, which is exactly what we had in the Cold War. The role that technology is going to play in this is, I think, disruptive technologies when you're talking about artificial intelligence, unmanned systems, counter drone technologies, drone platforms, swarms, quantum, cybersecurity, space-based platforms and communications network. All of this to me is analogous to what nuclear was in the first Cold War. The West and Russia got to a point of detente because there was this massive arms race around nuclear, and each side began to realize that this thing ever went to war, nobody wins, because the arsenal on both ends is so debilitating that conflict was not an issue. Conflict was not a solution. And I think what's going to happen now, where we're going right now, is we're going through that same kind of disruptive technology-driven arms race, where it is going to be a foundation where detente is going to be the focal area where, okay, the U.S. and the West has such an incredible arsenal of autonomous and robotics and swarms, as does Russia, as does China. Then conflict is not an issue. So if that's the case, then I think what you need to understand, you have the foundations for a sound, strong economic base. Because if you have a foundation for a strong, sound economic base, you have a strong foundation for a political base. If you have that, then you have a nation. If you don't have those two, then I think you see the potential for an erosion of a nation to be able to function. And that's kind of what happened with the Soviet Union is we did not get into a physical conflict. We prolonged the cognitive warfare long enough to allow the constructive powers of Western democracy and Western society to prevail, and to allow for the corrosive powers of an authoritarian regime, or communism in this case, to collapse. And I think we're going to see that same exact thing play out over the next 20 years.
If I could follow up just real quick on a point on a whole bunch of points that you made. Do you think that the economics and the political points that you've brought up are driving us and or making it easier to become much more of a multipolar world as opposed to a unipolar world, which is pretty much what we have now?
Good question. If I'm king for the day, I think the future of global society is almost like an expansion of the original American model, where you have a network of independent states that have agency and authority to do whatever they want at the local level. And they're working under a set of ground rules that basically puts us in the same sheet of music. That's what the foundation of the U.S. was supposed to be, and that's, I think, where we were heading for a good part of our history. And I think over the last probably couple of election cycles, we're starting to vacillate of whether we want to go to a form of governance and government that is based on strong centralized authority, or do we want to revert back to what we were, which is a bunch of independent states. I think if you look at what's going to happen globally, I think globally we're facing that same kind of decision, whether it's Europe or Asia. Countries are starting to have to decide what kind of future do they want. Do they want to have a future of independent agency and autonomy, or do they want to be under a bit of a centralized state authority? And this is where I think it comes back into play, which is what the CCP wants and is desires, is they want to be the leader of a movement or an effort where you have a couple of strong centralized states or entities that help drive global governance and all kind of report back into a central authority, or in this case would be Beijing, where I think the opposite is where I would hope and I would think the West wants to go to, is we can all be a bunch of independent nation states. Nationalism is perfectly okay. We're all going to operate off the same sheet of music. There's going to be some bit of basic ground rules and norms, and we're going to intertwine our economies and our societies to an extent that there's going to be a greater bit of a greater bit of a reliance upon each other, where conflict is not an issue, or conflict is not an option. So, and I use that to kind of articulate what it means here in the U.S. 2020 to 2024 was all the rage. Oh, we're getting into a setting. We're going down the path of a civil war. No, we're not, because I mean, if you canvass this room, if you canvass any room in the U.S., depending on the part of the world you're on, anywhere from 50-50, 60-40, 70-30, people are on one side of the political aisle or the aisle. We may agree and disagree with a great ton of vitriol, but our society as a country, I think, so well intertwined that we're going to find our way to sort our issues out and resolve it and not get into conflict. My hope and my desire is to see the same thing happen globally, where you don't have a central authority that's dictating governance and dictating authority and rule. You have a bunch of independent nation states, highly nationalistic, doing whatever they want, as long as it doesn't encroach on your neighbors, as long as it doesn't come at a level of conflict. And to get there, I think, would require for us to a certain extent, begin to intertwine our economies, intertwine our society and culture, where there is going to be a reliance on each other, but without authority. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, no, thank you.
This is fascinating. By the way, Bill, I like the art behind you. 3 years ago, in a few days, our community gathered every single day at 7:30 a.m. Because we came to Ukraine. I'm wondering, because we're just trying to also, that was more of like to help. I feel like we're at a moment where a weekly meeting isn't good enough. This is so happening very fast. If you were to form a panel with diverse opinions, I'd like you to think about who would you invite to this next discussion. Definitely on Tuesday. But we should be almost meeting twice a week. Steven's like going to prepare a presentation.
No, I just think
I mean, we do this anyways, but I feel like this is happening very quick. Now, you've got the 24-point playbook. We should just read that playbook for 20 points. But I feel like you're a great resource. I'd like to bring some others to the table in a 360-like style. And I know a few people, they didn't want to be on record today.
Yeah.
That's an issue. So maybe it's some private gatherings. But yeah, we're all here today to figure out how to, we all agree on tech transformation,
Yeah.
but geopolitical context, where do you do that? And, but I think bigger picture on just like mechanically of how our community should be helping each other.
Look, I've been tapped to speak to a couple of other groups like this, where it's a syndicate of thought leaders, business leaders, and community leaders that began very U.S. centric, but I think is very quickly morphing into an international network of vested capitalists, lack of a better word. I think it's important for us to continue that conversation. I'll go on the record here in terms of my politics. I do not believe in a strong centralized government. I think government is something that we elect to help kind of manage this enterprise. But I think society should be run in a bit of an open architecture where industrialists, investors, people of influence, capitalists are working together to create an open market of free and fair competition, and kind of let the winners go from there. So the more engagement, the more dialogue we have with stakeholders in the U.S., but obviously in Europe, Africa, Latin America, and Asia, I think it's critical, because I wanted to make sure that this concept of we the people, which was the foundation of the U.S. system, is something we export to the world. It's we the people mindset of we're going to take agency and authority and control over our future and try to create a network of intertwined business, personal, and social relationships that allow us all to benefit. If there's conflict, we'll sort our shit out. But sorting that out won't happen through direct conflict of warfare. It'll happen through engagement and dialogue.
There's a lot to think about right now.
We haven't touched on the Middle East yet in this conversation.
Yeah. So look,
the
the Middle East is an issue. China and Russia, to me, represent some significant strategic challenges that we need to fix. Full bias. I was born in Iran, came here to the U.S., and I lived through the Iranian Revolution. So my comments here are 100% biased against the Iranian regime. I abhor them, but I also view the regime inside Iran as the single most grave threat near term to geopolitical stability and peace in the world, primarily because you have a regime right now that's being run by a very narrow group of people who not only view and want to run it as a theocratic state, but their specific sect of ideology in Shia Islam believes in the ascendancy of the hidden imam, or the return of the hidden imam. That happens when the region is under complete turmoil and chaos. That's not who you want to have becoming nuclear power. And I think the failure of the West over the last 20 years is the failure to understand that that is who's in charge of Iran. That's not who you want in charge of Iran when the country becomes a nuclear state. On the positive side, I think the Middle East, more than ever, is on the precipice of a significant renaissance geopolitically and economically. I think if you look at the Arabs, if you look at the folks inside Iran not represented by the government, you look at Turkey, Israel, demographics are in their favor, and I think you have the potential for massive growth in the region. The issue there, obviously, is the Iran piece, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens over the next couple of months. I think, no doubt, Trump did not agree with the Obama approach to Iran, which was I don't want to get into that, so it's a whole separate call. But I think he obviously put a max pressure campaign on Iran in 2016 to 2020. I would not be surprised to see obviously a return of that, because I do think if you look at the regime inside Iran, it is on very thin ice, and that seems very similar to Putin and Xi. All three are authoritarian regimes that don't have a thick foundation of stability below them. But with Iran, if you do get regime change inside Iran, you're not going to get exactly what we want. You might get more of a Russia-style kleptocracy or oligopoly that's going to run the country. But what you do and what you should get, hopefully, is a removal of the Shia sect that has almost like an end times view of the world. And now you're stuck with a regime that is maybe not ideal when it comes to human rights, but is one that's not hell bent on lighting the Middle East on fire. That's the issue I think we're facing near term here with Iran.
And can we shift gears to the South China Sea and your thoughts on where we are there, and what does it mean given how the U.S. has spread so thin, fighting these multiple conflicts? How do you see things resolving themselves over in South China Sea and Taiwan?
Yeah, well, depending who you listen to, the South China Sea is going to turn into a hot war as early as 2025, 2026, 2030. The list is pretty wide in terms of where the speculation is going to be. The one thing that gives me a little bit of hope is China, and generally is not a country that likes to fight directly. Their view, I think, is more indirect. So yes, there's a threat of them one day waking up tomorrow and invading Taiwan. It's a real threat that we need to be obviously concerned with. But I think one of the things that they've seen, and this has been a lesson learned for Xi, and it's probably why he wanted Putin to go first in terms of a nation state land grab, is he wanted to see what global cancel culture was going to look like on a geopolitical stage. And he saw that. But he also saw is it's not easy to conquer another country. And this is a flat terrain where you've got a bunch of embeds within Eastern Ukraine to help you win that war. And Russia has had a pain and a lot of difficulty in doing that. Taiwan's been getting ready for this for decades, and it's an island. So invading an island is a lot more difficult than invading a sovereign piece of territory that's flat. So I think what China's probably going to try to do is much more of a longer term campaign in terms of what they've done with Hong Kong, which is the slow asphyxiation of trying to bring the Taiwanese into their fold. So do I think the South China Sea is going to go hot? God, I hope not. Do I think you have a potential for hot conflicts, whether it's with the Philippines or other fires in the region? I think that's a real concern. The dynamic that would change that, though, is if you have a rapid decline or ascension of challenge to Xi, because Xi is the Communist Party is no longer what rules China. I think what Xi has done over the last several years is very quickly consolidate power. This is no longer a country that's run by a single party. It's a country that's run by a single individual. At some point, Xi is going to have to deal with some hard truths driven by collapsing demographics, a collapsing real estate sector, migration of jobs out of China, and real pressures on their economic foundation. At some point, 1.3 billion Chinese people are going to wake up and realize that though they were on the path to being part of the global economy in a major powerhouse, they're facing some significant issues that have been mismanaged by one person, and that's Xi. 1.3 billion people. If you look at the Communist Party and the folks that are around Xi keeping him in power, estimates range anywhere from a couple million to 20 to 30 million people. So if things get really bad at home, that's when I think you have a risk of Xi doing something stupid, which is going after the South China Sea. In terms of conflict, I think there's probably a greater chance that Xi actually marches north and starts constituting land back in his favor in Siberia than he does heading into the South China Sea. Hope I'm right on that one, but we'll see.
So we have a hard stop. Mark told me at 9, so we're going to rapid fire some questions. So short questions and a quick answer. So Adam first. Adam Blanco.
Thank you, Stephen. Hamlet, always a pleasure listening to you. Always.
Love reading your stuff too.
Thank you. My question to you is your thoughts on the negotiations with Putin. Trump has literally given away a number of negotiating chips, such as having the discussions with Putin, giving him status as a legitimate leader, inviting him to the G7. How do you explain that, Do you have insight on that?
I do not. I'm not even going to begin to try to figure out how Trump operates. Like I said, I think if you look at his style, to a certain extent, he probably likes to operate in a world of chaos, doing the unconventional. That's who he is. He's not a refined political savant who's been a political operator for decades. He is what he is. He is a shrewd, hard-charging negotiator who cut his teeth in probably the most brutal fight there is, which is New York real estate. And I think he's bringing his style and his tenets to that. If I was president, is that the approach I would take? Probably not. I'd probably take a different approach, but he's the guy who's in charge right now, and this is the style he's taken. And I think to a certain extent, it's unconventional, to put it mildly. Is it going to work? Look, obviously he's betting it is. In that kind of a style, though, if you do like to operate through chaos and uncertainty, you can't look at every action and judge it in a vacuum. You got to understand that this is one move of many. So I would think in his mind, this is a way of getting to some sort of near-term physical peace, while allowing us to work on a much greater, grander peace, which is hopefully the removal of these authoritarian misfits in Xi, in Putin, and in the regime that's inside Iran. And this is, I think, the beginning steps of it. What that means, going back to Stephen's earlier slide, is geopolitical instability, I think, is just beginning. It's not ending anytime soon.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Definitely.
Maxwell, you've been very patient.
Yes, hi everyone. Maxwell here from Singapore. Really appreciate this earlier call. So, it feels like, Hamlet, we've been in, conflicts, I don't know, ping pong for just forever. But I remember distinctly there was a period where this sort of stuff just wasn't happening over and over and over again. So I guess my question is, what do you think it would take for all of this conflict ping pong to start to dissipate, and for the world to get back to, what some of us might remember, 10 years ago?
You're not going to like the answer. More conflict. And I don't mean more conflict in terms of more war, but I think a conflict in ideology. We're not going back to where we came from. But if anything, I think what the last couple of years and the next couple of years represents is basically the end of the World War II era as we've known it. I think the world is about to change as we know it. Between 1890 and 1950, the world changed. You had the rise and fall. You had the fall of the British Empire. You had the rise of the U.S. The U.S. as a superpower. You had a complete balkanization and fracturing of the Middle East and Eastern Europe. You had 2 world wars, you had a pandemic, and you had a global market crash. The world went from the horse and buggy and oil-powered lamp to the nuclear age and landing on the moon. All that happened in 60 years. Disruptive technologies were, I think, a key driver of that had significant impact on geopolitics and global governance. We're going through that same kind of innovation cycle and change right now. But it's not going to take 60 years for this to sort itself out. I think it's going to take probably the next 10 years, which means massive, massive, massive amounts of geopolitical instability and uncertainty and change. I think we can come through this, but I think it's imperative for private capital and leaders within industry to be attached at the hip so we can navigate this. As allocators and as investors, if you do the kind of the long-term buy and hold approach that had worked in the prior 60, 70 years, you're not going to do well. If you're plugged in and if you're informed, and you're trying to develop information edge and advantage, and you can allocate in a very, very nimble, focused fashion, I think there's an opportunity for significant wealth creation in the next 10 years.
Thank you.
Anthony Gordon.
We're going to close this off. We have to, but carry on.
Anthony, one-part question.
Yeah, only one question, Anthony, not 7. Love you though.
Okay, well, firstly, there is no one question because, as we know, it's extricably linked continent, impetus-wise, etc. So I'll ask it and then just cut me off, etc. So basically, and forgive me if I didn't hear, my memory's short. I didn't hear talk about energy independence, US, and so I would say that there is a forward during the course of time that you described. And so the question is, if I'm correct, does some form of US energy independence create a change into this forward mantra? Trump as a headline is less or no war, right? And so what does that actually mean? And then how the fact that China's put down its roots into the rare earth minerals in Africa, and then how does that feed from that north up into the south? And then lastly, in that regard, Europe, which is part of the impetus for this, from whether it's Mideast or the Gazprom cutoff, how does that now play into it? I'm just trying to create these tangible things and what it means. And then the other thing I didn't hear is that what I would say is not necessarily a 70s style resurgence, but there is clearly a lot of disruption.
I'm muting them. All right, I love you. You want to answer that?
Go right ahead.
I'm reading lips there, I think. No, but it's a great multi-part question. I think it actually answered back and tie a lot of these pieces together. First of all, I think China has some significant issues. I think what China has done over the last 20 years through their Belt and Road Initiative is they put out a lot of money and influence throughout the world to basically to colonize. Is exactly what they've done physically and financially. They're taking over nations and resources. That's no different than being a predatory payday loan provider. And I think what's starting to happen in the global south and Latin America, particularly, as well as Africa, I think you have nations who are starting to wake up and read the finer details of the loan docs that they'd signed and realize that they're royally screwed. But what's starting to happen is I think you're starting to see, and I think you will see more of these nations begin to default and basically tell China to go pound sand. That opens up the opportunity for Western capital, both European and US, to come in and start partnering with local families, local industrials in the global south who want to rebuild and reshape their country and want to bring in that Western style capital. The issue there with China is if all these countries begin to default, that is going to significantly accelerate the pressures that Xi is going to have at home, which, going back to what I said earlier, could be a trigger for Xi becoming more desperate, more violent if he faces imminent collapse at home. In terms of energy independence in the U.S., I think under the current administration and hopefully going forward, energy independence is going to be a key foundation for the U.S. I am pretty bearish in terms of geopolitical instability in the near term, in the next 10, 15 years. I think as a society, we can come out of this, but we got to sort our own stuff out. If I look at nearshore or kind of what's happening in the Western Hemisphere, I think there's a real opportunity for the creation of a super economic base or a superpower in close collaboration between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. And I think eventually that movement can move out throughout the Americas. I don't want to say I don't care about what's happening in the rest of the world or Europe or Asia. I do, but I think there's a real opportunity for there to be almost a bit of self-reliance, at least in North America, if not throughout South America. On the European front, I think Europe is going to have to go through their own kind of growing pains here. I think the European model of creating the EU and the EC being worked on paper, I think it failed in execution. I think they're going to have some serious issues they're going to have to sort through, not only economically, but also geopolitically and from a demographic standpoint. So I think Europe is, I think they're probably entering their quote unquote lost decade where they're going to have to find a way to soul search and figure out what their form of self-reliance and self-governance is going to be. And what scares the shit out of them is you have a belligerent bear on the Eastern Front that wants to march westward. So Germany, I think, is deflated, and I think who comes out very strong in this process is I think Poland. I think Poland now is probably positioned to become one of the de facto leaders in Europe because they're massively spending on their own self-reliance and autonomy and defense, and they view themselves as kind of the guardians or the plug that's initially going to prevent that Western expansion by Putin. I think that that addressed all the questions you had, all the points you brought up.
Michael Heimer, I'm sorry, but we're up against it at the 9 o'clock mark. So next week, please. And Hamlet, thanks very much. Any closing thoughts for you, Hamlet?
I'm near-term bearish, long-term bullish. And I think the future is in our hands as leaders in capital industry. I think we need to work together and create this network of interreliance of capital. I think the future is very bright. I think the amount of innovation that's going to happen is going to reshape the way we live our lives. As a technology investor, I just hope that we continue to invest in technology that liberates and integrates and does not give authority and power to a central agency or central authority to control us, because that's what you have in China. But the future's in our hands at this point.
Thank you very much. Great session, Hamlet, and appreciate your providing the insights that you did.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
We'll see y'all. Thanks for the opportunity.
Sure.
Yep. We'll see y'all. Bye.
See you shortly.
Simon, you on your way?
Still live.